Okay, I'd like to welcome you all to this podcast of the REBT Advocates. I'm Dr. Michael Edelstein. I'm a clinical psychologist. I have a website, 3minutetherapy.com, and fortunate and honored to be joined by Donald Robertson, who's a modern Stoic and a cognitive behavior therapist, and has written a number of books, including How to Think Like a Roman Emperor and Stoicism and the Art of Happiness. Welcome, Donald, to our podcast, and thank you for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me along. It's a pleasure to be here.
Good, good. So I'd like to start if you give a very brief overview of Stoicism to the viewers, and then we'll explain it further by comparing it and contrasting it with REBT. So what is the elevator speech for Stoicism?
Well, if I just give you the elevator pitch, I guess we have two parts. One is who the Stoics were, and another one is what they believe. So Stoicism is an ancient Greek philosophy that became popular in Rome, and it was founded at Athens in 301 BC by a Phoenician merchant called Zeno or Citium. It was heavily influenced by the philosophy of Socrates that preceded it. And in terms of the elevator pitch for what Stoics believe that virtue or excellence of character is the only truly important thing in life, and that external events that befall us are relatively indifferent by comparison, and that by achieving this mindset we can fulfill our potential and become more emotionally resilient.
Okay, very good. So I have a question already about what you said, and that is virtue is the main goal in life. Is that right?
Yeah, the Stoic maxim is that virtue is the only true good, but that requires a little bit of unpacking. So with Stoicism, there's some antiquated terminology we sometimes have to kind of elaborate on.
Okay. So, and how do the Stoics define virtue?
Yeah,
what is virtue?
Okay, so the Greek word for virtue is arete, and we're kind of stuck with the translation virtue, but really it means something reaching its potential or excelling at something. And so with regard to human beings, so the virtue of a horse would be to be strong and run fast or whatever. The virtue of a chair would be to be sturdy. And for Stoics, the virtue or the arete of a human being is to fulfill our potential to live rationally and wisely and to have a smooth flowing and harmonious life. So it's kind of reaching our optimum potential as human beings, basically with an emphasis on rationality.
I see. Okay, very good. Now, intuitively, that sounds right, although I think REBT goes at this a little differently, and that REBT says the purpose of REBT is to come up with your own goals and your own objectives, not necessarily to fulfill your potential or anything like that. You figure out what you want to do in life and then use REBT to achieve that. So Albert Ellis has said, if you like war, work for war. If you like peace, work for peace. So we're not going to tell you what's right for you. It's a subjective judgment. And what would be your view of that, Donald?
Well, I think then we get into doing philosophy proper, as it were, because like Stoicism is a combination of therapy and philosophy. These two things weren't clearly distinguished in the ancient world, so it's kind of mishmash the two. And the Socratics in general, I think, would say that, look, in order to choose your own goals, there's a prerequisite that you need to have in place, which is the ability to think rationally and clearly about those goals. Because if you're thinking dysfunctionally and irrationally, then you're probably going to choose goals badly and inconsistently. So Socrates and the Stoics would say, look, before you even get to choosing your goals, you need to polish up your reason and make sure you're able to use that faculty effectively. And that would be largely what they mean by living wisely and fulfilling our potential as rational beings.
I see. But they do have a specific idea of what your potential is, and that is being virtuous, and they have an idea of what virtue consists of. So that is part and parcel of Stoicism. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, it's a fairly broad idea. Like the Stoics define virtue in abstract terms. And actually, what I should say, a good way of defining virtue, the word virtue, by the way, we have to qualify and say, look, it is kind of misleading. It's not the ideal term because of the Christian connotations of the word virtue, which obviously came later, kind of distort the Stoic meaning a little bit. So sometimes we might just say excellence of character is what the Stoics mean by arete, or fulfilling our potential. And so when we talk about virtues such as justice or self-discipline and so on, like in the whole Socratic tradition, those terms really just mean applying reason to particular areas of life. So what Stoics mean by justice, or dikaiosune, would mean interacting with individual human beings or society as a whole in a rational manner, or interacting wisely. And individual Stoics might disagree about the fine details of what that would actually look like in practice, but what's more important to them is the general principle that we should interact with society or other individuals on a rational basis.
Okay, and again, this is somewhat of a difference, because according to REBT, a goal, if you want to achieve goals, is rationality, but it's not rationalism. It's not a doctrine that you should be rational. But if you would like to achieve your goals, then probably the most efficient, logical way to go about it is by being rational. Now, REBT has a specific idea of what rationality consists of, and that is eliminating all demands, all absolutes in your worldview. There are no musts, there are no shoulds, there are no have-tos, just our human preferences. I prefer to do well and get approval, but I don't have to. I would like you to treat me well, but there's no must saying you have to. And it would be great if life were fair, easy, and hassle-free, but there's no law of the universe it has to be. What would be the Stoic view on rationality?
Well, I think if you ask them to define rationality, they might actually approach it in a slightly different way. But the things that you've just described, nevertheless, would be markedly consistent with Stoic philosophy. And in fact, you might argue that whether or not, we don't know to what extent exactly Albert Ellis was influenced by the Stoics. He mentions them quite frequently, and he clearly read them fairly closely. And he mentioned that he started reading them in his adolescence, actually. And this aspect of REBT actually sounds, on its face at least, very similar to certain fundamental aspects of Stoic philosophy, although the Stoics would articulate it in a different way. They don't tend to talk about musts and demands and so on. Instead, they talk about a distinction between different types of values that we impose on our experiences. So there are kind of strong or rigid types of values, and then there's this kind of more flexible value that the Stoics call axia, which is also described as having a preference. And this kind of distinction between these strong values that the Stoics see as being at the root of psychopathology, emotional disturbance, and this kind of flexible preference, or a lighter value as they sometimes describe it, seems on its face to have some similarity to this REBT distinction between rigid demands and flexible preferences, I would say anyway.
I see, very good. And Donald, what are some of the strong values that Stoicism refers to?
Some of the, sorry, I didn't.
What are some of the strong values? You say there are strong values. Did I get that right? Stoicism refers to?
The Stoics would say, they do kind of give specific examples. They would say that, I mean, essentially this problem arises, they think, if we view anything that isn't directly under our control as being of more importance than our own rationality itself, is one way that the Stoics would articulate that. And this would, like love of money, love of reputation, love of health would be, or physical beauty would be three of their most common examples, basically. And those will become pathological if they're too strong and we're not willing to accept those desires being thwarted to some extent.
I see. Now,
Without becoming distressed.
yeah, so in terms of these strong values, part of it comes from the dichotomy of control. Is that right? That the Stoics believe there are things that are out of our control and there are things that are in our control, and it makes no sense to worry about things out of our control, but focus on what's in our control. And basically what's in our control is our thoughts, desires, impressions, those kinds of things. Is that correct?
Yeah, like that's broadly correct. There are a number of ways that the Stoics articulate this or approach it, but this distinction between what's under our control and what isn't is pretty central. And the Stoics would see it, again, because they're approaching it as a philosophy, they would see it as irrational or inconsistent to strongly desire something in the sense that we demand that it must be so-and-so if we don't have 100% control over it. Because the demand that something must be so-and-so and the knowledge that we don't have 100% control over it, they would argue are inconsistent. They show an inconsistency or an irrationality in our thinking.
Right. Now, am I correct that the ancient Stoics believe there's a clear line between what's in our control and what's not in our control? And I think REBT sees it somewhat differently, and that nothing is totally in our control, mainly because we're imperfect humans with imperfect brains, but many, many things can be influenced by us. For example, what another person does is not in our control, but we can influence it. So rather than not trying to influence it because it's not in our control, it makes sense under appropriate circumstances to try to influence another person's behavior. So would you say that's a difference, or do I have that wrong?
I would say that Stoics would actually agree with that. And the distinction they're concerned to make isn't between degrees of control. It's between things that are completely under our control and everything else, basically. And they're not suggesting that things that we could influence. I mean, the Stoics would obviously recognize that there are a great many things in life that we can influence, which aren't directly under our control. And if they said that we should never attempt to influence any of those things, that would be a completely untenable philosophy of life, because it would lead to total passivity. So the Stoics are clearly not saying that we should abstain from attempting to influence all external things. What they're saying rather is that we should learn to focus more importance on our own acts of volition, basically, or the locus of our control. So they would assume that when we say that we have influence over external events, what we mean is that we influence those things immediately or indirectly by exercising our behavior, actions, or our voluntary thoughts. And so we should learn to focus more on how we're doing that and take greater responsibility for the way that we go about doing it.
I see. Now, there's a famous anecdote that Epictetus describes and related in the Enchiridion about going to a bath, where Epictetus advises you, if you're going to go to a bath, and this was in ancient Greece or Rome, that expect splashing in the bath, because that's the way people are in the bath. So just expect people to splash and expect to be splashed, and don't upset yourself about this, which sounds fine as far as it goes. But getting back to the control and influence, he doesn't say anything about trying to influence the other people not to splash, or don't stand near the splashers in the bath, or things like that. Now, is that an over interpretation of what he's saying or not saying, or does he say somewhere in the Enchiridion, does he recommend trying to influence other people?
Yeah, indeed. Well, first of all, without a shadow of doubt, Epictetus would say, of course, we should attempt to influence other people insofar as it's reasonable to do so. So there's no question about that. So historically, many famous Stoics occupied important military or political roles. Epictetus happens to have been a freed slave, so he didn't have any political power in that respect, although many of his students were women noblemen who did, and he believed that he could influence his students, so he dedicated his life to teaching. If he thought it was, he had no influence over them and he was completely passive in that regard, he wouldn't have bothered dedicating his life to teaching, arguably. But he also says that if there's too much smoke in the building, then you should leave it. And it's clear from the other things that he says that he acknowledges that there's a role for what the Stoics actually call the discipline of action, which is going about attempting to influence the world and other people on a rational basis. And actually, to come back to the example that you give about the baths, Marcus Aurelius gives another Stoic, a follower of Epictetus, gives a kind of similar example where he talks about wrestling in the gymnasium. And he says that if you're fighting somebody in the wrestling, you should expect to get kind of punched and gouged and stuff. And the Pancratium, for example, it's a very violent sport. But you shouldn't get upset about it because it's part of the sport that you're engaged in. Nevertheless, you should attempt to avoid being hit by that person. Right. So he's saying it's really about not getting upset. Right, but nevertheless, you shouldn't just kind of like stand there passively like a jellyfish or something. You actively attempt to avoid getting injured because that's the nature of the game that you're involved in. And the Stoics distinguish actually at a more kind of theoretical level between several aspects of their philosophy, actually three aspects. But the two that matter here are the discipline of action and the discipline of fear and desire. So the discipline of fear and desire says that we shouldn't get unnecessarily upset or excessively upset about events that befall us, which is kind of what you're talking about in preparing for going to the baths and being splashed and so on. But that has to be reconciled with the discipline of action, which says that we have to take action in the world and in interacting with other people in a manner that's consistent with our values.
I see. Thank you for that. And so do the Stoics say we have to take action, or do they see it as a choice? If you're in a smoky building, you have a choice. You could stay there or get out or run to a different floor or save someone else above yourself who's also in the building, things like that. You have various options.
You have various options, but they think you have an obligation to yourself to act in a manner that's optimally rational. Because they would say that in order to fulfill our potential as human beings, we have an obligation to ourselves to kind of be the best version of ourselves that we can be, to put it very simply. And so they would say, well, you should act in a manner that's in accord with reason and avoid kind of typical irrational patterns of behavior, if you like. But that might manifest in different courses of action. They're not super prescriptive about the specific way that you'd necessarily act in the world. And individual Stoics might disagree about the best course of action in a given situation.
I see. Okay, good. Now, so we were talking about what's in our control and or what's not in our control, but how we can influence it. Now, the other end of the spectrum is that what is in our control, and it's my impression Stoics think that there are things like our thoughts, which are entirely in our control, which is different from the REBT view, which is we're imperfect humans with imperfect brains, so even our brains are not entirely in our control. We can influence our brains, and we can use reinforcement and repetition to get certain ideas in our head, but we're never going to do it perfectly because getting these ideas in our head is not totally in our control, but we have a great deal of influence over that. And how would the Stoics see that nothing really is entirely in our control?
Well, first of all, I'd say, okay, this is a slightly tricky one to answer because I'd say that the Stoics, in my view, agree with REBT in this respect, although I think they'd articulate it slightly different. I don't know if they'd say that nothing is under our control. But I would say that it sounds to me like what REBT really wants to say is that some of our thoughts are under our control and some of them aren't, or some aspects of our cognitive activity is under our control and some perhaps isn't. And the Stoics would wholeheartedly agree with that. They're by no means, in fact, they're not interested in attempting to claim that a whole domain of our experience is entirely under our control. Rather, they're interested in saying, look, identify that part of your experience that is under your control, and then we need to think about what you're going to do with that. But they're certainly not attempting to say, sometimes people read them as saying that all of our thoughts are under our direct control, and they're definitely not saying that. And in fact, we know that they're not, because, well, first of all, they'd have to be crazy to believe that. But secondly, they make a formal distinction in their terminology, in their theory, between aspects of our thinking that are under our control and aspects that aren't, that are kind of like automatic thoughts, as we would say today. And the Stoics would call those fantasiae. And they would say, for example, in dreams or delusions or just in ordinary everyday life, there are thoughts or psychological experiences that happen automatically or spontaneously that aren't under our voluntary control. And there are also aspects of our mental experience or emotional experience which aren't initially under our direct voluntary control, but we can learn to take more control over. Chrysippus, the third head of the Stoa, who happened to be a long-distance runner, compares this to running really quickly. And so there are many Stoic metaphors that revolve around certain themes. One of them is walking or running. And Chrysippus says, look, if you're running really, really fast, like becoming really absorbed in your thoughts and becoming quite emotional, you're in what the Stoics would call a passion, then, and something crosses your path, it can be very difficult to avoid colliding with it, or it can be very difficult to stop running. Because although running in a sense is under voluntary control, you kind of lose a degree of control over it once you become absorbed in running very fast. And the Stoics talk about being thoughtful or mindful is comparable to somebody who's walking barefoot and slowly and has exercising more control over where they place their feet, for instance. Right. So Chrysippus recognizes that when we're in a passion, we kind of lose a certain amount of control over our thought, behavior, and emotions, but we can regain that with psychological training. And also from the outset, there are aspects of our inner experience that are voluntary and aspects that aren't.
I see. So it is a little more nuanced than I've read it, or that you would think without getting deeper into it, sounds like. Epictetus, I have a quote from Epictetus where he says, "He is a wise man who does not grieve for the things which he has not, but rejoices for those which he has." So it's my understanding of the Stoic approach is that it's a philosophy of joy, wall-to-wall joy, by rejoicing in those things you have and not grieving for those things you have not. Whereas REBT has a different perspective, and REBT says if you have preferences, that means there are advantages if you achieve your preference, and that leads to positive emotions. But there are disadvantages if you don't achieve your preference, and that leads to negative emotions. For example, if my wife dies, it would make sense to grieve, mourn, cry about this, but not just briefly, but for the rest of my life, when I think about my wife and that she's gone now, and it would make sense to feel sad, to feel disappointed, or very, very sad and very, very disappointed. So throughout life, that's a large example, but even with smaller examples, throughout life, I'm going to have frustrations and blocks to my goals. So throughout life and throughout the day, I'm going to feel sad at times and happy at times, depending on whether I'm getting advantages or disadvantages based on my own values. Now, is Epictetus saying something radically different here, or am I taking it too literally?
Well, again, I mean, I would place a different interpretation on the Stoics than that. The Stoics don't generally say that we shouldn't grieve at all, to pick the specific example. So with all the examples you're giving, I think we can approach them in terms of the specific example at a more kind of theoretical level, if you like. And sometimes that can be tricky because we have to wrestle a little bit with ancient Greek terminology, which does kind of cloud things slightly. And sometimes that's an issue with doing ancient philosophy. We have to kind of wrestle with the terminological differences a bit. But in one of the trickiest areas is the terminology that they use in relation to emotion. Because the Stoics want to distinguish between aspects of emotion that are under our voluntary control and aspects that aren't, which actually I think is a very contemporary psychological distinction to make. And often when people are reading the Stoics, that distinction doesn't come through very clearly. It's a little bit clearer, I think, in the original Greek. So the Stoics, in practice, certainly wouldn't say that we shouldn't grieve at all if we're bereaved. They would find that unnatural. And in fact, they consistently say that the wise man isn't a man of stone or a man of iron or a man who has a heart of stone. And they said if we were to uproot all of those emotions, we would make ourselves into something less than human. So that's categorically not the goal that they're aiming for. But what they think is that there's a kind of natural emotional reaction that we have to things like bereavement, which we should accept as inevitable and natural in life, but we should be wary then of adding to that or amplifying it beyond certain bounds, beyond rational bounds. So they think that there would be a kind of rational limit to grief beyond which it would turn into something more pathological, like depression, for example. So even today, we might say well, there's a distinction between being bereaved and feeling natural grief and that turning into kind of pathological depression, and maybe a kind of a grey area somewhere in between. And that's what the Stoics are similarly interested in, making that distinction. So that natural grief is fine, but pathologizing it, turning it into something that goes on too long and becomes too excessive, they'd want to avoid.
Okay, very good. Let's take something much less dramatic than a loved one dying, but let's suppose I lose a $10 bill. Now, if I lose a $10 bill, I'm going to feel sad, regretful, disappointed. It's not really that big a deal, but I still feel somewhat frustrated and negative about that. So where does that fit with be content no matter what happens?
I think the Stoics would probably, well, I mean, an example like that, the Stoics would possibly see as trivial and not worth getting particularly upset about. Although, I mean, again, I guess it depends on the context. So they would say it's rational to have a preference to have enough money to serve your fundamental goals in life. So if you have lots of money and you lose $10, it might be completely trivial, totally indifferent to you. Whereas if you really need that $10 in order to survive and eat, then it might be obviously of more significance. So it's going to be of varying degrees of importance, obviously, depending on your circumstances. And it would be rational to assign what they call axia, or selective value to it, depending on those circumstances. That's going to vary depending on who you are and what your life is like. But once it's happened, they don't think it's worth compounding the distress that's caused. They accept that there would be a certain amount of loss that you'd experience, a certain emotional reaction. But the way they phrase it metaphorically is that the wise man might be grazed but wouldn't be wounded by a loss like that. So he would feel something, but he wouldn't allow himself to get deeply upset about it. He wouldn't invest strong values in it. It wouldn't be comparable to the value that it would be more important to him to exhibit composure and wisdom in response to the loss than to grieve the loss, for example.
I see. Okay, one last issue, and that is, it's my impression that the Stoics recommend the pursuit of virtue, but not the pursuit of pleasure. So if I do things just for pleasure, if I go to San Francisco Giants baseball game just for pleasure, I feel good watching baseball, then that would be out from the sage. In modern day life would not go to a baseball game just for pleasure. Is that correct?
Well, it wouldn't be out because to ban it, to prohibit it, if you like, would suggest that they would think it's a bad thing. And the Stoics say that pleasure is relatively indifferent in the grand scheme of things. You know, what's more important is rationality, wisdom, and virtue. So pleasure potentially has a place. It would be legitimate to pursue pleasure within certain reasonable bounds. So if we pursued it so much that we sacrificed our own welfare, like by abusing drugs or something like that, then that would be irrational. It'd be unphilosophical to do that, and the Stoics would be against it. But you know, having hobbies that are healthy and rational and within reasonable bounds would be consistent with a good life. Pursuing that kind of pleasure shouldn't become more important than looking after our own mental health and fundamental well-being, though. It's not something that we should ever be willing to sacrifice for those sort of transient pleasures. That's really the point that the Stoics want to get across. But pleasure is not bad. They would think it would be actually pathological to view pleasure as bad. That would be a sickness as bad as someone viewing pleasure as being all important in life. So it's really somewhere in between. It has axia, it has selective value, but it's relatively trivial in terms of the grand scheme of things.
I see, I see. That's clear. Now, could we say that a clear distinction between REBT and Stoicism is that Stoicism says pursue virtuous life, whereas Albert Ellis would say the purpose of life is to have a ball, enjoy yourself for most people, and if there was a purpose, that would be the purpose in life. So would that be a clear distinction?
Well, sometimes Ellis, I think Ellis might even have said at one point that his view about the goal of life was more like Epicureanism than Stoicism, and certainly that way of describing it makes it sound a bit more like Epicureanism, although even the Epicureans would say rather than having a ball, that their goal would be a kind of quiet pleasure, a sort of contentment or satisfaction, as it were. But yes, the Stoics would say that, you know, getting better is more important than feeling better, as it were, that flourishing psychologically is more important than the actual feelings that we have. So the wise man does have a ball, in a sense, or rather he has a kind of deep gratification that comes to him in life. He has a sort of deep and lasting sense of joy that's part of the goal. But that's not his primary aim. It's more like a byproduct or a side effect. And the Stoics are concerned, as many modern psychologists are actually, that if we try to make pleasure our primary goal in life, that we'll be tempted to pursue shortcuts towards it. And also in some ways it can be counterproductive to focus too much on subjective feelings rather than focusing on our actions in the world. So the Stoics rather say that we should focus on acting in a healthy and rational, consistent manner in a way that we would expect pleasure or joy to result as a side effect, but we shouldn't make that our primary goal in life.
Okay, very good. Well, I appreciate you discussing this with me. I got some answers from you for questions I've had for years in learning about Stoicism, so this has been very rewarding for me. We've been speaking with Donald Robertson, a modern author of Stoicism. And if you have comments or questions, please write them below, and please give us a like and subscribe to the REBT Advocates to stay on the rational side of life.